Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is going to be the third installment in our November series, and I'm realizing now that it's probably going to spill into December, and that's okay, on different issues kind of flowing through the presidency of JFK. I am joined today by Dr. Eric Rush. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Anybody who's been following the series knows it's a tag team, you and I taking this on.
Yeah, which has been great. It's been good to get to have the conversations with you, Chris. I think we've had a lot of fun on both A Fork in Time and A Room Where It Happened. So very glad to join you again for this latest installment. And even though it is going to probably drop in December, just know that we are recording this on November 28th.
Yes. So today's episode is about the Bay of Pigs invasion. So do you want to kind of give a little bit of a background on it, Eric, or would you like me to?
I can give a little background, and if it's okay with you, can I give just a little bit of background on Cuba in general? Because I think that the kind of the backstory of between Cuba and the United States plays a large part in why it's so important.
I always pull myself back from this, but you know what? Let's make this half this friggin' show nothing but what actually did happen. So yeah.
So
you have as much leash as you need.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Chris. So Cuba and the United States have really had a very intertwined relationship for a number of years, for over 100 years, and I think most of the listeners will recall that Cuba had been a Spanish colony for many years. And really, it was until probably the late 19th century where you really saw some interest from Cuba in independence. And there were several rebellions that occurred in Cuba from between about 1868 and 1898, and they had varying levels of success. But it still saw Cuba fundamentally under Spanish rule until the Spanish-American War. And so the Spanish-American War started in 1898, and events that happened with the USS Maine and in the Havana Harbor had a lot to do with us even getting into the war. And ultimately, the settled peace that was a result of that saw Cuba becoming a quote unquote independent republic as the Republic of Cuba, but was really a U.S. protectorate, which is very interesting when we think about this now, how much influence the U.S. really had on Cuba, especially during the first half of the 20th century. And then, I think about kind of the first inflection point in our story today, Chris, as being the coup of 1952. And so I don't know if you have anything you want to say about the coup of 1952 that saw Fulgencio Batista come to power.
So I do want to talk about Batista a little bit. It also builds to something we'll get to later on. I think it was the earlier episode on the Lime Lobby where we talked about if you're studying Mexican history for about a 50-year span, you need to find out where Santa Anna is.
Right.
If you're looking at Cuban history for a good 20 to 30-year span, you need to find out where Batista is.
I would completely agree. Yeah, really between, I would say probably the early 30s at the latest, and up until really 1959. Right. You really do need to know where Batista is. I totally agree, Chris.
So why do you say the 1930s? Because that's where I thought we were going back to. But let's build up from there.
Well, so there were a lot of rebellions that occurred in Cuba even during the early 20th century, and Batista was responsible for or was heavily involved in a couple of them, and I'm going to call it the Sergeant's Rebellion, and I think that's right. But this was a group of soldiers who were revolting against the current Cuban government or the Cuban government at the time. And that was my recollection, is that's kind of where Batista got, we'll say, his start as a revolutionary.
He started there, basically in the next government. For those of you not familiar with military ranks, he was a sergeant when that happened, and he walked out of there commander-in-chief of the Cuban Armed Forces. There's a couple of steps that he jumped.
Yeah, quite a few steps that he jumped. That is not a typical military career for everybody to go straight from, well, I don't know if it's straight from sergeant, but quickly from sergeant to commander-in-chief. So yeah, very, very, very true. And then he had some various forays into leadership in Cuba, and was kind of in and out of favor a couple of times. And so, where was Batista before 1952? Kind of in the events leading up to the coup of 1952. Where was he?
He was waiting around. He was an ex-president.
Right.
He was actually elected in what just basically everybody considered a free and fair election in 1940.
Mm-hmm.
And he did step down in 1944 when there was another election and the opposition defeated him.
Mm-hmm.
The opposition defeated him in 1944. And this is one of those other interesting things. Cuba at this point did have a single-term presidency.
Yep.
So the person he lost to in or the person who defeated his successor,
mm-hmm.
because there's always a successor, you're never running again.
Right.
His successor in 44, also that kind of clicked, that party won again in 48.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1952, the coup that we're talking about, Batista's making noise about running again because now he's not president. He can run again.
Right.
As I understand it, he's not exceptionally popular in this run.
Correct.
But he is still very highly placed and very friendly with a lot of people in the military. So he decides to short circuit that election of 1952 and put himself in charge.
Militarily.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, because he knew that it was very unlikely that he would have won the election of 1952. And just to have the US and Cuba connection solidified a little further, where was he serving his exile?
Miami?
He was in Miami.
And it's not just him in Miami. There's
No, you're exactly right. It is a whole community of Cuban exiles, and there were early and late Cuban exiles. I mean, there have been a lot of we have many Cuban Americans in Florida especially, but all over the country. But they immigrated here in several waves.
Yeah, and this was one of those interesting things we didn't get to in another podcast where we touched on Cuba. A lot of that has really had an effect on American politics.
Mm-hmm.
That large population. And by the way, how those Cubans came, why they came, what wave they came in, also has a really big effect on how they vote and how they experience the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree there. I don't think there's any question of that. So at this point, it's 1952, and there's been a coup, and so now Batista has taken over by military force and is now back in charge of Cuba. Again, he was still at least in some sense a U.S. ally at this point, and so he was our guy. But over the course of the 1950s, we soured on Batista a little bit. He suspended the 1940 Constitution. By the way, for those of you, let's call back 5 minutes ago. He helped write the 1940 Constitution. He became president because of the 1940 Constitution, and then he turns around and throws it out the window. And I think if we look at it at the time, the 1940 Cuban Constitution is fairly progressive.
It's really progressive. Looking at kind of the things that came out of first that revolt of the sergeants you talked about in
Right.
1933, I'm reminded of, I'm just going to draw another comparison to Lázaro Cárdenas, the president of Mexico at this point, who also was really progressive. And you kind of had this first wave of almost anti-American Latin America, anti-United States Latin American progressivism. You interestingly, if you look at what's going on in Spain right then,
right,
Cuba and Mexico sent a lot of help to the Republic. The only other country that did anything for the Spanish Republic, Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Soviet Union. I'd actually kind of forgotten about that, Chris, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing, looking at some of the things that were passed by these earlier Cuban governments, they're saying that for any enterprise, you have to employ 50% Cuban nationals. You have, they're giving rights to tenant farmers, that they have the right to a certain percentage of their crop. If you're a small sugar farmer, you get so much of your sugar refined for free. There's minimum wages, there's hour restrictions. And the interesting thing is, from what a lot of Americans think about pre-Castro Cuba, pre-revolution Cuba, they think the United States ran it.
Right.
But during this period we're talking about, there was an ebb and the flow of that. And I think the ebb of that really starts in 1952 when Batista comes in, and he does start undoing a lot of those reforms that had been put in place.
He did, and I think at that point it's very true, Chris, that the U.S. was certainly not running things in a political sense, but it's also equally true that there were a lot of U.S. moneyed interests that were heavily involved in Cuba, and Batista was heavily involved with them,
whether they could declare how they got that money or not.
Absolutely, and obviously we're not just talking about about American industries that we would ordinarily consider to be above board. We're also talking about things like organized crime, which was certainly a factor there. And it's interesting, but in the 1950s, we think about Cuba as being this exceptionally poor country, and we can talk about why that is, because there are many reasons why that is, both because of U.S. involvement and other reasons. But in the 1950s, Cuba was a pretty wealthy country by those standards, even though that wealth was not necessarily very well distributed. There was certainly a large poor population of Cubans, but there was a lot of wealth that was circulating throughout the island, and so that's. But I think it's important to think about the large poor population as you get into the late 1950s and people really start souring on Batista. There's always a why. I mean, you don't get a Castro and a Che Guevara and other people that just show up to an island that is wealthy and well run and say, hey, we should do something different.
It's just they don't get anywhere.
Well, you can have people talking about it, but you're right. You're not going to get a successful revolution without a reason to revolt. And in this case, you had to develop a reason for people to be dissatisfied with status quo. And so I guess we're kind of at this point, if we're thinking about the history of Cuba, we're probably up into about, let's call it about 1956, maybe, Chris. And so at this point, you have a number of different leaders of kind of what we would call revolutionaries, and they're not necessarily all communists or any of them, most of them really clearly communist or anything like that. They're mostly what I would consider to be more kind of populist, I guess, is at least initially is what I would say. Chris, I don't know how you would react to that.
I would say there's kind of what they want to do economically, but the unifying factor is what they want to do nationally. They are nationalist.
Yes.
They are just national sovereignist independence people let's kick out, maybe not kick out the Americans, but let's, Cuba for the Cubans.
Cuba for the
and
Cubans.
Once we get that, then we'll figure out how to distribute things and answer all those other questions.
Right. And at first there were a lot of different movements, and there was, and I agree with you, Chris, there were definitely those central themes there, but they had different ideas about how to do that. But one of the revolutionary movements sort of gained preeminence by, I would say, between 1956 and probably 1958. And that is of course Castro's movement, or what we will sometimes hear it called the July 26th movement. So he became really kind of the leading dissident force there. And what's interesting is, by this point, again, we're probably 1957, 1958. The U.S. is kind of souring, we'll just say that by the U.S. I mean the Eisenhower administration. It's kind of souring on Batista. And so what's fascinating about this is during this time, we were not supporting Batista. We were indirectly supporting Castro, which when we think about it now seems really odd. And by indirectly supporting mean that we were embargoing weapons from Batista. And so he had to acquire them through other means. And I think I don't know where he got them through like Dominican Republic or other places like that. But, he really did. He really was not getting U.S. support. And we were kind of tacitly supporting Castro's forces because we saw him as somebody who would bring democracy, maybe, to Cuba. And so that was kind of one of our stated goals, is to bring quote unquote democracy to the Caribbean and Latin America. Now, did we do a good job of that? Did we pick the right people for democracy? It was very mixed for us.
Well, you can argue that. It's also, once we got him in, did we really? We'll talk about this in a second, but I do want to come back to let's just finish up how Castro got there, how Castro finished up. And, the famous scene is on New Year's Eve of 1958. Mm-hmm. Batista got on a plane with, I've heard, $300 million.
I've heard the same number, $300 million. And again, this is $300 million in 1958 dollars.
Yes.
So probably, well over $1 billion now.
Yeah. And flew initially to the Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. But was so toxic there that he wound up living out his life in Portugal. Mm-hmm. But what's left out is in early December, I want to say the date I saw on this was the 12th. Not only had we embargoed arms to Batista, but the United States ambassador sat him down and said, "We no longer support you as the leader of Cuba. You need to go away.
You need to go away." And he did. It took him a little while, but he did by the end of the month. And then it was a matter of days after Batista left that Castro's forces entered Havana. It was January 9th, I think, maybe, or something like that. It was very, very soon within 1959 that Castro's forces entered Havana. And again, we initially saw him as bringing democracy to Cuba.
Now, here's the interesting thing. 1959, this is still Eisenhower. Eisenhower is still president for literally 2 years in January of 59.
And I would also point out, not only is Eisenhower president, Richard Nixon is vice president. And that's actually kind of important.
Okay. So we've got Castro in power. Take us forward from there.
Okay. So Castro's in power. It's 1959. The relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, or at least the Castro regime, soured pretty quickly. So he did a couple of things that we didn't like. And so one of the things that we really didn't like is he legalized the Communist Party. We were not a fan of that. The other thing that he did was he purged pro-Batista forces within the law enforcement and military, and some of those people were executed. I would say that was not something we were excited about, but that was probably not the deal breaker. Some of the deal breakers that were that he started taking land and other resources from U.S. companies, and that was a huge deal. He nationalized industries. He took land from people, And when this is the United States, I mean, we don't like it when people mess with our money,
right.
For better or for worse. And so then we responded to this, and again, this happened over the first year or so. We responded to this in 1960 by imposing sanctions and a trade embargo. And this has been a decades-long trade embargo on Cuba. And so Cuba said, okay, so we're not able to trade with the United States. I bet I know who else would like to trade with us. And so they signed an agreement with the Soviet Union in 1960. So obviously, we are no longer fans of Castro at this point.
Okay. So let's. By the way, do you have anything to say about Cuba in the 1960 election? Because it actually comes up.
It comes up, and so I'd mentioned, of course, that the vice president in 1959 and 1960 was Richard Nixon, who was also the Republican candidate for president. And in many of the debates, he squared off against John F. Kennedy, who was the Democratic nominee for president. And it was a very different Republican and Democratic Party at that point. But Nixon had already had some pretty good chops as a Cold Warrior at this point, and so nobody doubted that Nixon was an anti-communist. Nobody felt like he had a particular need to prove his bona fides for this. Kennedy was not that person. Kennedy needed to prove, or certainly felt like he needed to prove that he too could be a Cold Warrior and that he had anti-communist chops. And so during the debates, Kennedy, not Nixon, came out as the person who was the more hard line against Cuba. And so that really set the backdrop for what he did and what he felt he had to do once he was elected. And so, yeah, go for it, Chris.
One other thing I find interesting. First, you kind of had and not as much, but in the the early 50s, you had this idea of, in the United States, that Truman had lost China.
Yeah.
The fact that it was our country to lose is something we don't need to talk about.
Right.
But that it was the weakness of the Truman administration. And what McCarthy is saying at this point is the flat out treason of people within the State Department that are intentionally giving advice that leads to Mao's successful revolution in China. There's hints of that in Kennedy's attacks on the Eisenhower-Nixon administration of, you lost Cuba.
You lost Cuba, right? Sorry. Go ahead, Chris. And this, and just to kind of follow that up, this is sort of shades of the Monroe Doctrine as well.
Yes.
And so this is this is the Western Hemisphere is ours, guys, and you lost this country for the communists in the Western Hemisphere. This is in our backyard. And
by the way, the interesting thing is, one of the attacks that Kennedy makes, and this is going to be important for what we're going to talk about later, is not so much that you lost it because you didn't support Batista enough.
Mm-hmm.
You lost it because you supported Batista in all of these crazy, horrible, bad things he's doing. Right. And like you said, created the conditions that led to Castro.
Right. And so if we could have interrupted this way earlier, then we may have had somebody who really was pro-democratic and pro-American, who really could have run Cuba as, our style of liberal democracy. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll never really know for sure. I mean, we can certainly speculate, because that's what we do on this show, but that is certainly something we could speculate about. So yeah, so very, very interesting kind of interplay between what was going on with Cuba, that we kind of chased them into the arms of the Soviet Union in some sense, or at least that was their perspective on things. And you had a very significant set of discussions about Cuba in the 1960 election, and as we've already talked about on the show, so you and Don had talked about the 1960 election as a what if, and so, but now we're talking about it as a what did, and so through a very, very small margin, Kennedy won the 1960 presidency, and so came in 1961 with certainly optimism, certainly the overall support of the country. but not really the hugest mandate of any president that's ever come in. And he's young. He was a U.S. senator for some amount of time, not a huge amount of time, and so he has to prove himself.
And let's take one more other and trace some other things that are leading into this. When he does inherit the presidency, he inherits a plan that the Eisenhower administration has been working on to remove Castro from Cuba, to remove the Cuban government and replace them with a more friendly government.
Yeah, that's right. So let's back up. We're going to talk CIA. And this discussion is not going to be very pro CIA, and hey, some of my best friends are spies, but still, we're not going to be terribly pro CIA here, because there is certainly some assumptions that they made in all of this that were probably not good ones. But yeah, by 1960, it was pretty clear to the U.S. government, again going back to the Eisenhower administration, that Castro needed to go. And so but this is not something that we felt like we could just go in and take him out. Can't just invade Cuba, because the fear was that the Soviet Union would invade somewhere else, West Germany, other places that we do not want them to invade. So we feared reciprocity. So the idea was, if you get the CIA involved, and instead of having a U.S. force that goes in, you had a group of Cuban exiles that they trained as counter-revolutionaries, and you drop them in somewhere in Cuba, and they go and they oust Castro, and they take it back over, and somebody else is installed as the leader of Cuba. It seems very nice on paper.
By the way, this isn't new. This isn't fresh out of the box. They've done this in a couple of other places.
Well, and the place I'm thinking of off the top of my head is Guatemala.
They started the first one. We actually worked with the British on our first one and helped them overthrow the Iranian prime minister in 54 time frame.
Sure.
Basically went in and threw a bunch of money to, yes, this guy, when you hear the name, you're going to be surprised. Ayatollah Khomeini's street religious people. We threw around some money, and they got our friendly Shah back in power. There's also the suggestion that they were involved in the colonel's coup in Egypt that overthrew Farouk II there and brought in Nasser.
Yeah.
And then Guatemala. By the way, looking back on these, Nasser in Egypt, Iran, these are not a highlight reel.
Right.
Guatemala worked out pretty well. And in each of these cases, it worked out relatively well, that in each of these instances, they had basically thrown some crazy plan together, and it worked. And it wound up working. So when they're putting this plan together for Cuba,
let's put another crazy.
It's worked up till now.
It's worked up till now. So let's put another crazy plan together.
Right.
And so they put this crazy plan together that was approved by President Eisenhower, and then this group of I think it was something like 1,400 people trained in Guatemala, and there were some CIA operations officers, and if memory serves, there were a few U.S. military attachés that were there, but it wasn't a quote unquote U.S. force that was training.
It wasn't a U.S. force that did most of it. There were American pilots that were involved.
And that's actually really important to the story, because that was one of the reasons why the Bay of Pigs was chosen, and another area wasn't chosen is because of airfields, and also just because of the ability for, I think it was B-26 bombers to be able to get to the area.
So let's Kennedy inherits this plan.
Yep.
Let's pause real quick because I know we sometimes have some sponsors. So here's a word from the sponsors. When we come back, we're going to talk about what happened, what was the actual plan, and how we think it changed from there.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. So, yeah, we just spent a good half hour giving you what actually what did happen. Let's see how long it takes us to talk about what could have or what might have. So, it's January 1961, and one of the first things on Kennedy's desk is this plan to overthrow Castro and install a friendly government in Cuba. Now, you were talking about B-26s,
right,
and American bombers. What is the story behind those?
Well, my understanding is that this was a kind of a three-part plan. The Bay of Pigs, the Cuban, we'll say that the Cuban insurgency or counterinsurgency. This was we hadn't decided on Bay of Pigs for some amount of time. There were a couple of other options, including one that was a little further away from Havana, as memory serves. But the idea was that there would be some strategic bombing of the areas by these B-26s before that forces were landed. These were naval forces that were landed. And so there were three parts, of course. There were these, we'll call these, a Marine force, if you will, because they function as Marines, basically, that came across on boats and were supported by air. And that actually becomes really important later in the story, that there was this initial air support. And the plan called for continued air support, continued naval support, and continued logistical support for these Cuban troops that had landed at the Bay of Pigs.
Okay. So what were the other options? What else was on the table?
My understanding is that one of the things that was on the table was an alternate location called Trinidad. Do you want to talk about that? Do you know anything about that, Chris?
Yes, I do. Trinidad is a little more. Cuba's really easy to talk about geographically because it's just a long, thin stretch of land. So Trinidad is a little closer to the middle. It's almost in the middle of Cuba. And if we're talking about this here, Havana is on the northwest side of the island, the closest part to the United States. But interestingly, for what we're talking about here, the closest part also to the Yucatan and Central America. Mm-hmm. These bombers, this air support was operating not out of the United States territory that's 90 miles away. It was operating across the entire Gulf of Mexico from friendly airstrips in Nicaragua and Honduras. Mm-hmm. This area, Santiago, is the other. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's further away from Havana. Mm-hmm. Countries like to keep a lot of troops in their capital, so you don't want to attack right there if you're trying to get set up. Santiago is also an actual city. It's a port. Anybody who knows anything about the discussions of D-Day in World War II knows it's helpful to have a port because that way you can land all of your troops a lot quicker. You can get all of their support ashore a lot quicker. But the third, and I think the most important thing to think about when it comes to Santiago is that it is a port itself, but it's in the foothills of the Escambre Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And the Escambre Mountains are were at this point the base camp of one of those other anti-Batista revolutionary guerrilla groups that didn't exactly go along with the Castro game plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the idea was, one, it's further away from prying eyes of the enemy's capital. It's got a port, so you can land relatively easy there. And the hinterlands, the area that you're going to be advancing into, is already probably friendly and has some people there that you want to provide assistance to,
Mm-hmm.
and will provide some help to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that pretty fair?
I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I think those are definitely things that we wanted, and I think, you know, one of the things that probably maybe doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway, is that under no circumstances did we think that it was just going to be the 1,400 people that were going to do all of this. The idea was that they were going to find popular support. They were going to basically build this movement against Castro, and that movement of many people was going to eventually sweep them towards Havana, and they were going to retake the island.
Speaking about, by the way, go back to one thing. Castro himself, the entire Cuban Revolution itself, started with one boat, the Granma.
Mm-hmm.
It landed in Santa Clara area, which is further east of the island, almost over towards Lake Santiago, or for Americans, that's where Guantanamo Bay is. One boat full of people landed, and it grew from there. So if you land 4 boats full of people, well, that's just a quarter of the amount of time, right?
That's 3 boats too many. Well, and the other thing that should be said is the Cuban Revolution had been reasonably successful to this point, but was not complete. You know, Castro did not have the real, you know, stranglehold on power that certainly, you know, Chris, you and I remember him having when we were growing up in the 80s. You know, this was a very different Cuba, a very different Castro at this point. And so there was still some consolidation that needed to take place. That becomes important a little bit later on, as in kind of the aftermath here. But yeah, so why did they not decide to go kind of the Santiago route, Chris?
Because it's, well, the Trinidad route.
Or the Trinidad
Santiago's,
route.
by the way, Santiago's on the other side, by where we keep Guantanamo Bay. If anything happens out in Santiago, the United States is getting the finger pointed right at them.
That is true. My mistake. So Trinidad, yes. So why did we not do Trinidad?
Because it's right in the middle.
Yeah.
Because it's too far from. We don't want to use Guantanamo because that is a little too close to our zone of influence. We didn't want to use. And the fact was, they had this idea of providing that air support. That is one thing they thought the United States could really do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a relatively newer, more technical field. We can go in and provide that. And if we got a bunch of bearded guys, we just drop them off in the jungle. And air support. Wonderful. This is beautiful. The problem was, because of where Trinidad is, it was too far for the air support to reach it from the bases they would be flying from. We're using one thing I do want to point out. We're using what are called A or B 26s.
Right.
A for attack, B for bomber, 26s. These are twin engine prop planes that we used back in World War II. These are basically contemporaries of the B-25s that you saw taking off in the Doolittle raid from American carriers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
these are a little bit of vintage equipment, but that's very important for us because if they're brand new jet bombers, nobody's going to believe these are Cuban defectors. They have to be actual kind of equipment that Cubans actually would have been using that would have almost trickled down to their military.
Absolutely. Yeah. We had to, we wanted to maintain some veneer of deniability. It was a very thin veneer. But we had to maintain some of that. So yeah, that's a very good point, and it plays into a part, but because these B-26s did not have the range as our newer aircraft did, and so we had to launch them. Because I recall, and I think you might have mentioned this, Chris, that these were all launched from kind of Central America. These were launched from kind of the other direction. These are not launched from a base in Florida.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
So they have this plan. As I understand it, it was actually presented to the Joint Chiefs.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the members of the Joint Chiefs, a guy named David Shoup, who at this point is the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps and won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his role in the invasion of Tarawa. Do you think this guy knows something about amphibious invasions?
Probably a little bit.
Almost laughed it out of the room because it makes a lot of rookie mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
The air support isn't continuous. When you look at even stupid little things, but when you do this for a living and are that good at it, you think about all of the medical supplies are on one ship.
Right.
All of the ammunition is on another ship. What happens if something happens to that ship?
Mm-hmm.
So this plan is really, and there's actually been interesting psychological studies put together about why did people not say more about this plan?
Right.
Why did these, respected military figures let this go through?
And it's been used as a case study in groupthink.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so why why does a group go together on something that if objectively we all recognize is maybe not the right course of action? And then also this Cold War mindset. I mean, I think that there was this idea that we got to do something. Yeah. Just the idea, because at this point, even though it may seem a little odd to us with kind of the modern lens, the idea of Castro remaining in power was at that point pretty intolerable to us. This was not something that was gonna fly for us at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we've got everything about the we've set up a lot of stuff about what is actually going to happen when boots hit the ground. It's almost anticlimactic because boots hit the ground. And yeah, you remember when I asked what happens if something happens to the one ship that all your medical supplies are on? Guess what? Something happened to the one ship that all your medical supplies are on. Yeah. They did land and it did not work out well. One of the things, do you want to talk a little bit about all of the different air attacks? Because this is a little convoluted.
Yeah, so there really is kind of a prelude to the invasion, and so just so everybody it kind of has a little bit of agenda setting. It was really early morning on April 17th of 1961 that I think about as being sort of your invasion day. But if you think about like the attacks beforehand, really kind of the 14th or 15th of April, you had some diversionary landings, and on the 15th of April, you also had a bombing of 3 Cuban airfields. And these were in different areas. These were not in the Bay of Pigs area. One was near Havana, and then there was a couple other locations that escape me at this point. But they were prepared to not have U.S. markings on them, and so they definitely were trying to disguise them at this point. So this happened about 2 days beforehand, that they had a lot of these planes happening, and there was actually one of the aircraft was lost, if memory serves, and so that's kind of interesting as well. And there was another aircraft that was damaged and managed to limp back home, not to Central America but to Florida. So again, it was a very thin veneer of our deniability.
It wasn't damaged, as I understand it. What they did is they took the engine cowling which, if you're
okay.
familiar with it, is that round piece of metal that covers the engine intake. They took that off the plane. They set it aside on the field. They shot bullets into it, and then they put it back on the plane so that it could land in Florida and say, we're Cuban defectors and we were shot at by the Cuban government, and here's the hole in our plane to prove it.
Okay. I did not know that. That's very interesting. So this happened on the 15th of April, and the Cubans complained about it. They complained about it to the UN, which is very interesting. So we're not being that sneaky at this point. The Cubans know something is going to happen. They don't know exactly where, they don't know exactly what, but they know something is going to happen. And interestingly, the ambassador to the United Nations at this point was Adlai Stevenson, who was, I think, tried to be fundamentally an honest guy, but had been lied to by the CIA. And the CIA said, nope, this, definitely not something we're doing here. No U.S. armed forces are involved. We're not intervening in Cuba. We're making sure that no Cubans, no citizens would participate in these actions. And so Stevenson said that to the UN, which was not true. And he was actually pretty upset when he found out that he'd been lied to by the CIA. So very, very interesting there. So again, you had this happen in the United Nations. Then you also had a purge of what they would consider to be suspected anti-revolutionary forces in Cuba, to make sure that any potential collaborators would have been detained at that point. So
to some extent, the Castro government uses this as an excuse. Use it to go ahead and round up some people that they were a little suspicious about.
Right. And so then over the course of April 16th, you start having the invasion fleet that assembles, and it assembles about off the coast of Cuba. And then very early in the morning of April 17th, I think it's two of the four ships maybe land, if I remember right. And the 1,400 Cuban exiles land, and they call themselves Brigade 2506. Which I think is very interesting, kind of bland sounding name for this sort of force. And they land troops, they land tanks, they land other vehicles. So that's how the invasion starts on the very early in the morning on April 17th, 1961.
How'd it go?
Not well. Not well. Well, so they had a lot of logistical problems. There were delays in unloading the troops. As you mentioned, there were some of their supplies did not come at all. It was really very problematic, and there were some additional airstrikes that happened in support of those troops at that point. So that was kind of in support of the overall effort, but it wasn't enough. There were some paratroops that were eventually dropped, which is kind of interesting that they would decide to do that. It only took a few hours before Castro to basically issue a statement over the radio, basically saying that these people are trying to destroy the revolution. They're going to take your rights. They're going to take your, they're going to kill you. And so that was happening very, very quickly. That this sort of thing happened. There was that night there was an additional airstrike that pretty much failed. Didn't really accomplish very much. And so, but by this point, the troops are not really making much, if any, progress, and they're using up their ammunition. And some of them are killed, some of them are starting to surrender. And so it's not going well by the 18th of April, by that next day.
And by the way, when you say airstrike, I almost caught you on something.
What
are the free? Are Cubans the only ones with planes in the air at this point?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that, Chris.
If you look at the records, there's the F, and you have to be very clear when you're reading this, because the FAL is the um, Liberty Air Force for the American-backed Bay of Pigs Cubans, but there's also the FAR, the Revolutionary Air Force, which are the Cuban Castro, because everybody's a Cuban in this scenario.
Everybody's a Cuban. It's just what side are you? What side are you on? You're exactly right.
The Castro Cubans are flying captured A-26s that we had given to Batista. So this is the equipment they're using, and they're bombing those ships.
Mm-hmm.
A, they're flying the exact same planes. B, these planes have the exact same markings because we're trying to pretend FAR. These are Cuban defectors.
That's right. Good. That is a really good point.
And then they start bombing the supply ships that are sending ashore everything. They do sink the medical supply ship, and it wasn't just medical, but it was all of the medical supplies were on that ship, and they damage an ammunition ship. I actually think they damage the ammunition and blow up the fuel ship.
Mm-hmm.
So, they're operating close enough for bombers to get there. They don't have anybody protecting them. They don't have shorter range fighters, and the Cubans are using their Air Force against these ships. And then you have the Brigade 2506 ashore, who are just shooting at, get to the point that they shoot at anything overhead because same planes, same markings,
right?
And we just saw one of our ships blow up. There's obviously pro-Castro Cubans above us. We're not taking chances.
Absolutely. And so at this point, so they have very, very few supplies. So a lot of their supplies have been destroyed. So very few supplies. They have very little ammunition. Their force at what's called Red Beach there is coming under counterattack by the Cuban army and unofficial militia. So things are not going well. There is a couple airdrops of more ammunition, so that helps a little bit, but it's still going very badly at this point. And so the other thing that should be kept in mind is, at this point, the Soviet Union is obviously not happy with this whole scenario, and the Soviet Union and everybody they're not stupid. They know what's going on here. And so Khrushchev sends a telegram to Kennedy on the day after the invasion, basically saying that they would not allow us to invade Cuba. And if we did invade Cuba, that there could be nuclear retribution at that point. So, this is starting to sound maybe just a little like the another crisis that we've talked about on the show that happened the next year. But Kennedy's caught in a very bad position here. You're either all in on this and you see what happens, or you're not all in on this and you see what happens. And so Kennedy kind of decides the latter at this point and says, we're not all in on this. We're not going to go in, because there were some Marines in Puerto Rico that were ready to go. That I don't know if you knew about that, Chris.
We did. I'm just going to go ahead and point this out. We just talked about them. We had Marines on the island of Cuba in Guantanamo.
We did that too. but
they're a bit closer.
They're a bit closer, but we had I guess we should have a separate group of Marines that were in Puerto Rico that were ready to support this, and and there were
aircraft carriers.
You had a lot of naval assets that were outside of Cuban territorial waters, but were relatively close by. So we had the equipment, and we had the people that could have been there to support this, but then Kennedy has to make a decision. And so, what decision does he make, Chris?
He cuts bait.
You're on your own. And once they were on their own, the U.S. air support stopped. There was no possibility for further naval support. And how long did the attack last after that?
After that, I want to say it was a 3-day total affair on the
It was
ground.
a 3-day total affair. So after the U.S. support started to disappear, it was within 48 hours, and the whole thing was done. The only thing that was done additionally there were some naval assets that were used to rescue people, and a relatively small number of these Cuban exiles were rescued by U.S. naval assets. So so there was a little bit of involvement there, but again, it was a rescue mission, not a true additional military operation. So that's what happened.
Yeah, I just realized we probably spent an hour on that.
So we just did a room where it happened.
Yes.
And if you liked Room Where It Happened, I would encourage you to look at that podcast as well.
All right. So what's your fork? What's your preferred? Because I set mine up pretty well, and I've got this is one of those rare instances for those of you listening. Normally we do a lot more talking off podcasts, and like when we start this, we know where it's going.
Right.
I've set mine up.
Okay.
What's yours?
Why don't you go first? Because I do have one in mind.
Okay. The Escambre.
Okay. Tell me about
that. We talked about it. The Trinidad landing site. It makes so much more sense if you are going to keep this off books.
Okay.
If you're going to keep this low U.S. involvement, that's where you do it. How many guerrilla forces have their own air force?
How many guerrilla forces? Not very many.
Yeah. Once you start bringing planes into it, you lose all sense of plausible deniability. You've got a bunch of people that are foot soldiers, that are infantrymen, that know Cuba, that could blend in, and you've already got people there doing the things you want. So why not build on that and further support that? If you capture an actual port, you can bring in boatloads of support to them. You don't need to worry about night operations and airdrops or anything like that. And that's probably an effective way to make this happen. Yeah.
I mean, that absolutely, it would be, by no means does that guarantee success, but operationally it's a much better plan than what was originally decided. So that's so I actually really like that idea. So I had a different one, and so this is great. I really like that yours is more kind of a different military operation. So mine is totally different, and mine relies on the influence of Dean Rusk.
Okay.
So we know that this was an Eisenhower initiated plan that was approved by Kennedy about a week after taking office. And so so you had a relatively, an inexperienced, a new president who had run on a Cold Warrior platform, and so felt like he really needed to have a hardline approach to Cuba. His Secretary of State was Dean Rusk, who actually served through the entire Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and had a long history as an assistant Secretary of State in a couple of administrations, but he had very big misgivings about this plan. He was not in favor of the plan, and he really didn't say as much as he later said he wished he had. So the point of departure is it's January 28, 1961, and Kennedy is let's just assume that there was a cabinet meeting that day. I have no idea if that was the case, or whatever cabinet meeting led to this approval. And Rusk says, "Mr. President, I don't feel good about this plan. I think its chances of success are very low. I think we should explore other options. I agree we need to take a hardline approach to Cuba, but not this hardline approach, because the potential for blowback is significant." And Kennedy says, okay, Mr. Secretary, what would you do instead? And Russ comes up with something that is totally different. We don't know what it would be, no idea. But somehow Kennedy tells the CIA saying, you know what? This is a new administration. I understand you had these logistics in place under the previous administration. Pack it up. We're not doing it. This is done. And then there is no Bay of Pigs at all. And I think that would be very interesting because I think, and I'll be interested in what you think about this, Chris. I think if there's no Bay of Pigs, there's no Cuban Missile Crisis, or at least not in 1962.
So I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I think actually you do have a Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
I'll admit maybe not 62.
Okay.
But the other thing is, I think you have a much, much worse Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, interesting.
So first, to kind of tie back into the last episode we did on the space race, and also capacities that we're talking about here, in Khrushchev's telegram of, I guess, day 2 of the invasion,
mm-hmm.
where he threatens nuclear destruction of the American heartland.
Mm-hmm.
How realistic is that?
Not very realistic at the time.
given the capacities of the Soviet Union at this point,
yeah,
it's not really realistic. But let's go down the route.
But where could he hit? So is he gonna? Yes. So again, I grew up in Kansas, mm-hmm. Chris. Is there any way that Khrushchev is going to hit Kansas in 1961 or 1962? Probably not.
He'd definitely go after Omaha. I don't think you guys would really miss that. I feel like there's some college football rivalries that are going to get settled
I lived in Omaha for 12 years. I like Omaha. It's a nice city, but yeah, Omaha would be a primary target because of the existence of Strategic Air Command. But he could.
By the way, that's why it's there. Because it's in the middle and is in the hardest part to hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, but he could hit other targets in Europe, mm-hmm. in Central Europe at that point, and that would have also been very, very bad for our alliance. He could certainly do some damage. One of the things that is not lost on me, and was not lost on Castro, and was not lost on Che Guevara, is the Bay of Pigs solidified their hold on power very significantly. And a fact that Guevara actually wrote a letter to Bobby Kennedy basically saying, you guys did us a big favor here. Because this revolution was not done until after the Bay of Pigs. And then once you invaded and everybody saw who you really were, then we could complete the revolution. So that's not lost on me that happened.
But I do want to come back to why is the Cuban Missile Crisis that much worse?
Okay, I want to hear this because that's an interesting perspective, Chris.
First and foremost, Khrushchev was a chancer.
Uh-huh.
He was a gambler, and as much hay as Kennedy in the 1960 election made out of the bomber and the missile gap, maybe he hasn't been this is one of those debates. How much of it was him being just disingenuous and knowing that we had technical superiority, but realizing that we can't say we do or say how we know we have superiority?
Right.
And how much of it was him just basing off of what he actually knew at the time. But I feel like by this April telegram from Khrushchev, he knew it was a bluff.
Uh-huh.
Khrushchev knew it was a bluff.
Right.
Khrushchev doesn't want it to be a bluff. And so if you got Dean Rusk's solution of taking a step back and, okay, we're engaging Cuba in other ways, maybe not militarily, those other ways aren't going to pay fruit by October of 62. That's true.
But is there as much of a kind of a sense of the need, the immediate need for having those missiles in Cuba on the part of either the Cubans or the Soviets if there was no invasion? And so that would be the question is I could easily see where you're right, that there is a worse Cuban Missile Crisis. Could it also be a later one?
It might be a later one. I haven't even gotten to what makes it so much worse.
Okay. Yeah.
This is one of the things I talked about in the 1960 election episode, which is when things change, people change.
Yeah.
And you're right that Kennedy, that Dean Rusk, and, isn't it kind of surprising that after something flops that spectacularly, everyone said they were against it? They just didn't say how much they were against it.
Very true.
But Kennedy is out there and he's looking back at his advisors, and every single one of them is now saying how much they were opposed to it. He changed his view of how much he trusted the military and his intelligence officers. He
Absolutely.
said afterwards, I want to break the CIA into a million pieces and scatter it into the wind.
He did say that. He didn't do it. But what he did do is he pushed several of the leaders of the CIA
Yes.
out by 1962.
Yes.
So it was a different CIA after 1962 than it was before.
So let's say that doesn't happen.
I see where you're going with this, Chris. I like this. This is okay. Play it out, because I like this a lot.
And you've now got this Kennedy who you just talked about. He doesn't quite have bona fides.
Mm-hmm.
He has been shown up at the Vienna meeting with Khrushchev.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and you're right. I think it's a possibility that it's later.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the Cubans can consolidate as much and see as much of a threat from the United States. That being said, I guarantee I don't see anything that would put any pause in Khrushchev pushing to have the missiles there as soon as possible.
I think that's fair. And this kind of comes back to our last podcast where we were talking about Jupiter missiles in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so this is Khrushchev saying, well, Cuba is our Turkey. And so if the Americans are going to have Jupiter missiles there, we want our missiles in Cuba.
Right.
So let's just say, here's the scenario I'm coming up with. You have a Kennedy that's not a little older and a little wiser, is still too trusting of military advisors. You have maybe a more difficult 1962 midterm election, because Kennedy is maybe not quite as popular as he would have been otherwise, and now he feels like he's in more of a political fight. And now it's 1963, and now the missiles are in Cuba, and now he has a choice to make.
Or even more so, even keeping the same timeline, and it's October 62.
Mm-hmm. Now you've got the elections coming up next month.
He does have the elections coming up next month, and he doesn't have that experience of why not to trust the military.
Right.
He's got pictures in front of him. He's got Curtis LeMay telling him that we will get every missile on the first strike.
Mm-hmm.
And without that learning experience from the Bay of Pigs, I don't think he stands up and says or looks for, because looking at the behavior of XCOM,
mm-hmm.
and from all of the tapes, he is sitting there seeking out answers from every single person.
Right.
That is not what he does going into the Bay of Pigs invasion.
No, it's not. And
that is a learning experience. That is something he learned.
Okay.
Because of the Bay of Pigs.
Okay. I like that, Chris. I like that. I think that, to me, that makes sense. So I think that is a very plausible result of that. I do still think that because there's more time needed for Castro to consolidate power, I do think it takes longer for the missiles to get there. But I could easily see where a less wise Kennedy would have been far more aggressive and far more trusting of military advisors to, again, let's say a 1963 or 1964 Cuban Missile Crisis that could go hot. So
Yeah.
I think that is a very plausible read on that, Chris. I like that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I really like that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Do you have any other thoughts you'd like to kind of wrap up? Well, we got a really good one, I think.
No, this was as always, Chris. You and I have just we have a great time recording these podcasts. This has kind of become sort of honestly sort of a weekend ritual for us lately. Is we get on and chat and record either a Fork in Time or a Room Where It Happened. And so the only thing I would say is I would just put a plug in for our listeners is tell your friends about these podcasts. You know, we love getting new listeners. And we love getting new collaborators. Again, Chris and I have had the fortune of getting to host together the past several weeks, but we're always looking for new collaborators. And you probably, anybody who's listening recalls, Don specifically saying that for a Room Where It Happened, we want listeners to be part of the content creators here, and we really do. And so tell your friends. And so I try to tell my friends that about the podcast. And I have, one close friend who I know listens regularly, and I'm trying to get some more friends that listen regularly. So I would definitely put in that plug.
I do second that. My friends are kind of sick of hearing me talk about the ideas before I come on. But those that aren't, they listen, and I'd love to make some more. Some more collaborators, some more opportunities to get some different opinions on here.
Absolutely. We're definitely looking for that. And so if you're interested, by all means, get in contact with Don through the forum or through email.
So we just wrapping it up. Want to thank everybody for your time today. And if you happen to come to a fork in the road, what should they do, Eric?
Take it.
All right. Thank you. And have a great, I'm going to say week. Have a great time, everybody. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.